For more than a decade, viewers have welcomed Craig Melvin into their living rooms each morning on Today, trusting his steady voice to carry them through headlines both hopeful and harrowing. Yet what many in their early retirement years understand, perhaps better than anyone, is that empathy, the very quality that makes a journalist relatable, can quietly become a burden too heavy to set down. Craig learned this not in the bright lights of Studio 1A, but in the silent spaces afterward, when the cameras cooled and the stories lingered, especially the interviews with grieving parents, wounded veterans, and families rebuilding after disasters. Moments when he leaned forward, eyes soft, listening not as a broadcaster chasing a segment, but as a son raised in South Carolina who knew something about hardship and dignity. And over time, those conversations began to follow him home, riding beside him in the car, sitting with him at the dinner table, whispering in the stillness before sleep, until one evening his wife, Lindsay Charniak, herself a veteran of demanding newsrooms and long days at ESPN, noticed the way his laughter had grown softer, the way his shoulders stayed tense long after the broadcast ended, and she recognized the look because she had worn it too. The look of someone who has listened so carefully to pain that it begins to echo inside their own chest. For couples in their 60s who have weathered layoffs, illnesses, aging parents, and the bittersweet quiet of children leaving home, there was an unspoken knowledge that carrying everyone else's sorrow eventually extracts a toll. And Craig, though younger, felt that same accumulation, recalling an interview with a widow who clutched a photograph as if it were a life raft, her voice trembling but resolute, and he had reached across the small space between their chairs, not to console as a friend, but to signal respect as a journalist. Yet later he wondered whether professionalism had been enough to shield his heart, because empathy does not stop at the edge of a television frame. Lindsay would sit with him on their porch after long days, the city humming below, and remind him that bearing witness is sacred work, but not solitary work, that even the strongest storytellers must learn to set the story down, a lesson many viewers of a certain age have learned through decades of caregiving and community leadership, the art of caring deeply without losing oneself entirely. Craig began to understand that what made his interviews resonate was not just preparation or polish, but the quiet permission he gave people to be vulnerable. And vulnerability, as anyone who has loved deeply knows, is never without risk. So he started small rituals, a walk before dawn to clear his thoughts, a handwritten note to guests whose stories moved him, a deliberate pause after particularly heavy segments to breathe and acknowledge what he felt, rather than bury it beneath the next rundown. He spoke candidly in conversations with colleagues about the invisible weight journalists carry, how each emotional interview leaves a fingerprint, and how the accumulation can blur the boundary between compassion and personal grief, a boundary many retirees recognize from years spent in classrooms, hospitals, courtrooms, or churches, professions where listening was both gift and obligation. Lindsay, balancing her own career and motherhood, would gently remind him that strength is not measured by how much sorrow one can absorb, but by the wisdom to share it. And together they modeled a partnership, grounded not in glamour, but in mutual steadiness, the kind of enduring companionship that resonates deeply with couples who have celebrated 30 or 40 anniversaries and know that the real triumph is not public success, but private resilience. Over time, Craig found a renewed clarity on air, not because the stories grew lighter, they rarely do, but because he had accepted that feeling deeply is not a flaw in journalism, but its heartbeat, provided it is tempered with care. And viewers sensed the difference in the subtle warmth of his follow-up questions, the respectful silence he allowed after a tearful pause, the way he closed segments with gratitude rather than spectacle. In an era when headlines move at dizzying speed, he chose deliberateness, honoring the human beings behind the news. And for those watching from comfortable chairs and homes filled with memories, there was reassurance in that steadiness, a reminder that even in a fractured world, empathy can be practiced with intention rather than exhaustion. Craig often reflects that the privilege of his role is not access to fame or proximity to power, but the chance to sit across from someone at their most honest and say, in essence, "I see you." Yet he also knows now that seeing others clearly requires tending to one's own spirit, a lesson reinforced by Lindsay's unwavering presence and by the quiet wisdom of older viewers who write letters describing their own journeys through grief and grace. When empathy becomes trauma, it does so not because compassion is weak, but because it is powerful, capable of reshaping the heart. And Craig's evolving understanding of that truth has made him not only a more thoughtful journalist, but a more present husband and father, aware that the stories he tells each morning must not eclipse the story unfolding at home. For an audience standing at the threshold of later life, contemplating legacy and meaning, his journey offers something familiar and comforting, the knowledge that caring deeply is never wasted, but it must be balanced with self-forgiveness and shared support. And as the sun rises over Manhattan and the familiar theme music swells, Craig steps before the camera with renewed resolve, carrying the stories entrusted to him with reverence, while remembering, thanks not in small part to Lindsay, that even the most compassionate heart deserves rest. And in that quiet equilibrium between empathy and endurance lies the true measure of a life spent listening.